Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's webinar. Before we begin, I would like to make a few reminders. Mute your microphone and turn off your videos to avoid unnecessary noise. Secondly, if you have questions, please keep the question link in the chat box and write them down as they will be answered by the speaker during the Q&A. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's webinar, organized by the Center for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism, Chinese University of Hong Kong. The speech topic for tonight is a debate over self-power and other power, the NianfoYuantong of OgurusuKōchō and Yang Rensan's response. We are delighted to have invited Professor Charles B. Zhong from the Catholic University of America as our speaker today. I would like to introduce our host today, Professor Chen, the director of the Center for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, who will introduce our guest speaker. Next, let's welcome Professor Chen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you everybody for attending our seminar tonight. We have Professor Charles B. Jones as our guest speaker for the evening. He's gonna talk about the debate between OgurusuKōchō, Xiaoli Xixiangding, and Yang Rensan on other power and self-power in Pure Land Buddhism. 谈有关他力跟自力净土法的这个他力自力问题。 And the Japanese Pure Land Buddhism was founded on the purely, I think everybody knows, other powered view. It means that Japanese Pure Land Buddhism is based on the idea that we rely entirely on outside forces to achieve rebirth to the Pure Land. And the Chinese patriarchs or masters who have taught Pure Land Buddhism have emphasized the unity, the combination of the self-power and the other powers. So this is true even for a Great Venerable Master Sandao. Even the Great Venerable Master Sandao is not exempt from this truth. However, Japanese Venerable Master Honen, 法然上人, believed that Sandao advocated the teaching of other power and follow Sandao's teaching to establish the Pure Land sect. But let's make it clear that this is the Japanese Pure Land Buddhism, which is very different from the Pure Land thoughts advocated and propagated in China. The evolution of this debate and the content of the debate is the main point that Professor Jones will explain to us tonight. He's going to talk about is how this debate has evolved and what's been said on it. Professor Jones is the full professor at the Catholic University of America. He's an expert in modern Buddhism. He specialized in modern Buddhism research, such as humanistic Buddhism of the Venerable Master Taixu, the modern Buddhism of Taiwan, and the thought of the Chinese Pure Land Buddhism. As far as I know, he is one of the most widely published overseas scholars on Chinese Pure Land thought, Pure Land teachings. He is also a very important American scholar of Chinese Buddhism. Now, please join me in welcoming our honored speaker, Professor Charles B. Jones. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. First, can everybody hear me? Is my microphone on?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, good. Okay, 我首先要说，我很高兴有这个机会跟大家集中在脸上。我恐怕我的中文能力不足够，演讲这么高级的题目，所以我一开始演讲我就改用英文。那我们的计划是我花差不多90分钟演讲，然后陈建煌教授来提供一个普通话的提要，最后有一段问答时间。恐怕我在中国人的面前讲中国佛教，我总是觉得是班门弄斧，请大家原谅。Okay, so now I will use English. That is all of my Chinese right there. Okay, so let me first say why I became interested in this topic. This is a story that I have told many times in the past, but it goes back to 1992. I was living in Taiwan, and I was gathering materials for my doctoral dissertation, which was a history of Buddhism in Taiwan. It was later published as a book. But because of some connections that my major professor had, I spent every Sunday afternoon for over a year at a Buddhist temple near the town of Sanxia in Taiwan called the Xilian Jingyuan, the Pure Garden of the Western Grove. So that was founded by the Venerable Zhi Yu, and he set up the temple, he established it specifically as a place to practice Pure Land Buddhism. So I went and participated in many events, including a one-day Nianfo retreat. And as I learned more about the life and the activities of the temple, I came to realize that this was very, very different from everything I had learned about Pure Land Buddhism while taking classes at the University of Virginia. And I began to wonder why. I came to realize that everything we were taught in the West about Pure Land Buddhism, both Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, was based exclusively on Japanese scholarship. And most of these Japanese scholars were located in sectarian universities in Japan that were affiliated with the Jodo Shu, that's the Jingtu Zong, or the Jodo Shinshu, the Jingtu Zhenzong. And they tended to see Chinese Buddhism through the lens of Japanese Pure Land belief and practice. So what I had learned was that Chinese and Japanese Pure Land Buddhism were almost the same. But now that I was in Taiwan and observing it for myself, I could see that Chinese Pure Land Buddhism was very, very different. So I began researching Chinese Pure Land Buddhism to try to present Western scholars with a more accurate picture of its nature. The result was a book that came out 4 years ago called Chinese Pure Land Buddhism, Understanding a Tradition of Practice, where I use the phrase tradition of practice to render the Chinese term Famen or Dharma gate. And so while I was interested in this, I looked to see if there was any time when Chinese and Japanese Pure Land had ever come into direct contact and talked about their differences. And so many years ago, a colleague sent me a book by the Japanese scholar Nakamura Kaoru that detailed a debate between the Japanese Jodo Shinshu missionary to China, OgurusuKōchō, that's Xiaosuqi Xiangding, and Yang Renshan, the very famous Buddhist layman of the early Republican period. I'm sure everybody attending this webinar already is familiar with him. And so I began looking at it, but I had other projects to do. But last year, I was invited to present a paper at a conference in Vancouver, Canada, for the International Association of Shin Buddhist Studies. And so I went into this debate to see how it had gone. And the paper that I'm about to present is the result. I know that we will have questions and answers at the end of this presentation, but I will say right now that I might not know the answers to many of your questions because this is still very early in this research project for me. So with that introduction, let me go into the presentation now. And let's bring up slide number 2 in the PowerPoint presentation. So this presentation concerns a debate over Pure Land teachings that took place between 1899 and 1901. The participants were, on one side, 2 missionaries from the Jodo Shinshu Higashi Honganji, OgurusuKōchō and Ryusen. OgurusuKōchō's dates are 1831 to 1905. Ryusen, Mr. Dragon Boat, is 1861 to 1931. So they represented the Japanese side. On the other side, we have the Chinese Buddhist layman Yang Renshan or Yang Wenhui, whose dates are 1837 to 1911. The debate caught my attention because I had known for many years that the Chinese and Japanese versions of Pure Land doctrine differed greatly, but I had never seen a direct confrontation of their views in debate before, at least not in print. Therefore, I decided to look into this debate in more detail. So in the following, I will give the historical background of this exchange, and then I will present samples of the back and forth between the two sides. and I will end with some concluding analysis. So now go to slide 3 in the PowerPoint presentation, and we will talk about the background of the debate. Now go to slide 4. The accession of the Meiji Emperor in 1868 initiated a crisis for Japanese Buddhists. Buddhism had served as an arm of government for the preceding Tokugawa government, and the new regime inaugurated a persecution of Buddhism in order to cripple its institutions. To survive, Buddhists needed a way to demonstrate their usefulness to the new regime, and volunteering to serve as missionaries in neighboring countries seemed to offer them an avenue. To the government, they argued that using Buddhism as a common cultural topos might make other countries more open to Japan's plan to enlarge its sphere of influence. The Jodo Shinshu was the first to send missionaries to other countries. So now go to the next slide, number 5. Between July 1873 and August 1874, the Jodo Shinshu Higashi Honganji deputed a priest named OgurusuKōchō to travel to China for a year of study in preparation for missionary work there. Ogurusu arrived in Shanghai and quickly relocated to Beijing to reside as a guest in the Longquan Temple. This trip was made possible by the resumption of communications between China and Japan as a result of the Sino-Japanese Friendship Treaty signed earlier that year. His experience in China shattered both countries' assumption that they believed and practiced a common form of Buddhism. Indeed, Ogurusu severely criticized the decadent state of the temples and the monks that he found on the mainland, and decided that China was a fertile mission ground for Japanese Buddhism, especially Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. Oops, what did I just do? Excuse me, I just skipped a page. Need to find my place again. Okay. Okay. His experience in China, sorry, I apologize. I suddenly skipped ahead in my script here. Okay, after returning to Japan, Ogurusu worked with the newly established Higashi Honganji editorial office to produce a short introduction to Shin teachings in literary Chinese, Wanyanwen, called Zhenzong Jiaozhi, Essentials of Shin Teaching, in 11 chapters. This pamphlet appeared in 1876, and in August of that same year, Ogurusu returned to China to open the Higashi Honganji Shanghai Branch Temple. That's the Shanghai Yuantong Benxing Biayuan. He distributed 1,000 copies of his pamphlet to the crowd that attended the opening ceremony. Okay, let's go to the next slide, number 6. For its part, the Chinese Buddhist world had mixed reactions to the presence of the Japanese Shin missionaries. Chinese monks objected to Ogurusu's defense of Japanese clerical practices of eating meat, drinking wine, and marrying. Others did not feel that China needed help from Japan to revive Buddhism, and feared that looking outside the nation for resources entailed a loss of face. Go to the next slide, number 7. On the other hand, some saw potential benefits in welcoming the new Japanese delegations and branch temples. Japan had encountered Western military technology and Christian missionaries several decades before China, giving them valuable experience in dealing with these intrusions. Others, such as the reformer Taixu, liked the Buddhist educational system and sectarian universities that they saw in Japan and thought they could serve as models for improving the educational level of Chinese monastics who were widely perceived as ignorant and parasitic. Japanese Buddhism appeared far more engaged with society and compared favorably with Chinese Buddhism, commonly criticized for its escapism and otherworldliness. Finally, many could see that Japanese scholars of Buddhism were able to use modern research methods and Indian languages in their work. Among those expressing ambivalence toward the Japanese missionaries was Yang Wenhui. According to Yao Changshou, in 1885, Yang met Nanzhou Bunyu, from his dates are 1849 to 1927, a priest of the Jodo Shinshu Otani branch. With Nanzhou's assistance, he recovered texts that had been lost in China for many, many years, among them a set of Pure Land writings that he published together under the title Jingtu Gu Yi Shishu, that is, 10 books from the ancient heritage of Pure Land. Nevertheless, Yang and Nanzhou never actually discussed Buddhist doctrines over the 20 years that they collaborated. Thus, it was not until his literary debate with Ogurusu that Yang pronounced on the relative merits of Chinese and Japanese Pure Land teachings. Still, Yang understood that Chinese Buddhism was in a state of decline, and he welcomed Jodo Shinshu missionaries as a potential source of revival, as when he sent a recommendation to Hangzhou that a Japanese missionary be welcomed there. And so we'll put up slide number 8. This will give the original Chinese text of the quotation I'm going to read. So Yang Wenhui wrote, "As the Buddha Dharma has been passed on to present times, it has lost much of its vigor and needs someone to revive it. Jodo Shinshu teachers from Japan have sailed the seas to come here to build a branch temple and open private academies. How could these not be an opportunity for reinvigoration? However, they have not been able to incorporate the understanding of the great harmony, Datong, into their plans or their structures, and are not without errors. Nevertheless, since they call themselves disciples of Shakyamuni, they mostly hope to cut through the barriers and rise to equal the Buddha mind, climb above living beings into the realm of purity, cut off the flow of samsara, and land on the shore of nirvana. So, without even seeking commonalities, we find they are already there. The monk Tokudai Shonin from Japan is going to Wulin. I have sent some topics to present to on the trip. The monk should strive with them." So that sounds a little positive. However, in other writings, Yang makes his low opinion of Jodo Shinshu orthodoxy very clear. Let's move now to slide number 9 in the PowerPoint, where Yang says, "The decline of Buddhism is truly due to the Chan school." No doubt this is true this is the case in China, but in Japan, the decline lies with the Jodo Shinshu. Lately, I have been reading some Shinshu books and find that they grossly violate the intent of the sutras. There are layers of debate, so in hopes of setting them straight, I have sent letters. I know they are not likely to make corrections, but what is the alternative? So go now to slide 10, and we'll look at the debates. Two books in particular prompted the responses that instigated the debates between Yang and Ogurusu. One was Honen's, or Faran's, Senchaku Hongan Nembutsu Shu, Anthology on the Nembutsu of the Select Original Vow, which had come to him as one of the 300 texts that Nanjo had sent him from Japan. The other was a work I've already mentioned, that is Ogurusu's Zhenzong Jiaozhi, Essentials of Shin Teachings. Yang wrote critiques of both these works, leading to the following two sequences of critiques and rebuttals. So go now to slide 11, and we'll look at the first sequence. First, in relation to Ogurusu's Zhenzong Jiaozhi, Ogurusu published Zhenzong Jiaozhi in 1876 in Japan, and as we've seen, he distributed it when he arrived in Shanghai. After 1898, Yang responded with Ping Zhenzong Jiaozhi, or a critique of the Essentials of Shin Teachings. He mailed this to Nanjo in Japan, who declined to respond directly, but he forwarded it to the Higashi Honganji. Ogurusu countered with Yang Bo In Zibian, which he mailed to Yang. And in response, Yang wrote, Ping Xiao Su Qi Yang Bo In Zibian. So that's the first sequence of works back and forth. Now move to the next slide, number 12, and we'll look at the second sequence. So second, regarding Honen's Senchaku Shu, Yang received a copy of the Senchaku Shu from Nanjo Bunyu. Yang initiated the debate with Ping Xuan Ze Ben Yuan Nianfo Ji, that's the Senchaku Shu. Ogurusu responded with NianfoYuantong, perfect interpenetration of Nianfo. Yang countered with Ping Xiao Su Qi NianfoYuantong, a critique of Ogurusu's NianfoYuantong. After that, Ogurusu was too sick to respond, so another Jodo Shinshu missionary named Ryusen responded with his NianfoYuantong Xiu Diao, and this ended the exchange. As Chan Jidong has pointed out, Ogurusu chose to focus on the teachings of Honen rather than those of Shinran, because he judged that a direct leap into Shinshu teachings would be too much for the Chinese audience. Thus, he avoided some distinctly Jodo Shinshu doctrines, such as salvation coming from true and trusting, the Xinjin Yihon, or Xin Xin Wei Ben, and that the evil person would be saved. That's the Ren Zhengji. So these doctrines do not appear in Ogurusu's writings. However, at the same time, as the above sequence makes clear, Yang Wenhui responded to his own reading of Honen, whose text became available to him independently of Ogurusu's publishing activities. Remember, he got the Honen's work because Nanjo Bunyu sent it to him. Now, both of these facts will help us to understand why so much of the debate reported below concerns Honen's Senchaku Shu rather than Shinran's teachings and texts, in spite of Ogurusu and Ryusen being Jodo Shinshu missionaries. I will note here that as I was reviewing this debate, I wondered why there was so much focus on Honen, and I had to keep checking and rechecking to remind myself that they were not Jodo Shu missionaries, but Jodo Shinshu missionaries. So with all that out of the way, we're ready now to go into the debate itself. So let's go to slide number 13, title card for part 2. Due to time constraints, I will confine my remarks to the parts of the exchange that deal with differing views on self-power and other power, zili and tali. Much of this revolved around Honen's writings on the arising of bodhicitta, or the mind of enlightenment, Dhamma Fa Puti Xin. This sequence of arguments came from the second set of exchanges that I listed above. That is, it comes from Ogurusu's NianfoYuantong, Yang's Ping Xiaoqiu Qi NianfoYuantong, and Ryusen's NianfoYuantong Xu Diao. Go now to slide 14. Ogurusu opens by saying that Nanjo Bunyu, a fellow Shin Buddhist priest, had forwarded him Yang's critique of Honen's Senchakushu. He calls attention to one of Yang's statements, which asserts that bodhicitta, Puti-sin, is the proper cause, Zheng-in, for rebirth in the Pure Land. However, according to Yang, the Senchakushu says that one may dispense with bodhicitta, and the word dispense there is she, abandon bodhicitta. He says this is like trying to get a south axle into a north rut. Now, I've got that in its original Chinese on the PowerPoint slide. That seems to be a kind of a literary expression. I hope that I am translating it right. If I'm not, please correct me during the questions and answers. But trying to get the south axle of a cart into a north rut on the road. To Ogurusu, Yang is accusing Shin teachings of violating the scriptures. And indeed, just before this passage, Yang had said very directly that Pure Land teachings must accord with the 3 Pure Land Sutras. Ogurusu then quotes Yang's message to Nanjo again. Here's the quotation. If there is contradiction, then we cannot regard it as the teachings of Shakyamuni. So Yang is making the point that if Jodo Shinshu teachings contradict the sutras, then they are contradicting Shakyamuni, and they are not legitimate. After noting some other issues raised by Yang, Ogurusu states that, inspired by Honen's example, he was moved to compose the present work, that is, the NianfoYuantong, as a response to Yang's criticisms. In his response, Ogurusu points out that Honen was widely regarded as an avatar or an incarnation of Mahashtamaprapta. That's Dashizhi Pusa, one of the 2 bodhisattvas that attend Amitabha in the Pure Land. Yang retorts that Mahashtamaprapta himself had involved all 6 faculties in his practice of Nianfo, including that of mind or intention. So aside from the 5 senses, there is also mind, and Mahashtamaprapta used all of them. Honen, on the other hand, made the claim that the Buddha Amitabha had selected, 选择, only the capacity of speech when he set forth his 18th vow. This is wrong, and Ogurusu misleads the reader by calling his work thoroughly penetrating, Nianfo, that is, Yuantong. Yang's implication is that bodhicitta, which expresses an intention, thus using the mind, must be part of the Pure Land path. Now go to slide 16, which will show you the original Chinese text of Ryusen's response. So in response to this, Ryusen says, Master Genku, that is Honen's, Nianfo was always first and foremost oral. Nevertheless, even oral Nianfo involves the mind. Thus, he says at the beginning of the Senchakushu that when beings begin to practice constant oral Nianfo, the Buddha hears them. When they constantly revere and prostrate before the Buddha sees them. When their minds constantly contemplate the Buddha knows it. As they remember and think on the Buddha remembers and thinks about them. These three acts of body, speech, and mind are not separate and distinct. Thus, they are called intimate connections, or qingyuan. As the Shoramgama Sutra says, when sentient beings recollect the Buddha, they will see the Buddhas manifest before them. When it says recollection, it is the mental faculty that moves. When it says nianfo, it is the tongue that moves. The tongue takes in all six faculties. This is called perfect interpenetration, yuantong. So, if Master Ogurusu titled his work Perfect Interpenetration, NianfoYuantong, what is the harm? I will say here that even though Yang and Ryusen say they're quoting Honen, in Honen's work, he's actually quoting Shandao. Thus, Ryusen claims that even if Honen advocated only oral recitation of Amitabha's name, the act automatically involves other faculties as well. Now, I will note that this response does not actually address Yang's main objection, that according to the scriptures, the generation of bodhicitta is a requisite of rebirth. So let me restate that again. Yang had said, Honen says you only have to recite the Buddha's name orally to achieve rebirth in the Pure Land, where the Pure Land Sutras say you have to generate bodhicitta, 需要发菩提心, in order to gain rebirth. So when Ryusen says, well, oral invocation involves the mind, he's not really saying that you're generating bodhicitta. So in my opinion, he has not really answered Yang's objection very well. So let's go now to slide 17. A bit further on, Ogurusu gives a brief overview of Honen's life. The detail that Yang notices is that Honen practiced chanting the Buddha Amitabha's name 60,000 times per day. And he remarks that this smacks of self-power. Ryusen's response attempts to reconcile such strenuous practice with complete faith in other power. Ryusen says, one must have faith in order to practice. If it arises because of the power of the Buddha, then we regard this as self-power. If the mind of the worldling, that's fanfu, produces it, then we regard it as self-power. Thus, when one chants the name 60,000 times, expecting it to redound as karma leading to rebirth for oneself, then this is self-power. If one chants the name after developing clear faith in the Buddha's wisdom, then this is other power. The distinction between self-power and other power lies in the source from which they arise. Honen was a man who had clear faith in the Buddha's wisdom. How would his practice verge on self-power? In other words, even a commitment to arduous practice requires faith, and that faith can only come as a free gift from the Buddha Amitabha. It is therefore rooted in complete entrusting to other power. Okay, let us go now to slide 18 in the PowerPoint. Continuing his narration of Honen's life, Ogurusu recounts a time when Honen engaged in the visualizations of the Contemplation Sutra, that's the Guanjing, and achieved all 16 of them. He says, when he mastered the visualizations of the water, of the earth, of the jeweled trees, and so on, by the year 1200, Amitabha, Avalokiteshvara, that's Guanyin Pusa, and Mahashtamaprapta, Dashirja Pusa, all appeared to him for 5 days. Yang remarks that this describes mixed cultivation and practices, that's 杂修杂行, belying Honen's advocacy of the single practice of oral recitation. Furthermore, even oral recitation has an element of self-power to it. So to put that in other words, Yang is saying Honen is a hypocrite, that he's telling people in the Senchakushu that all they should do is oral Nianfo, Kōchō Nianfo, but he himself is practicing the 16 visualizations of the Contemplation Sutra, which are very, very difficult. And so he thinks Honen is not being very sincere. So Ryusen replied, all this shows is Master Honen's merit. How could it be considered the basis for mixed practice or mixed cultivation to make an escape by oneself? Now, mixed practice, because of not being the various practices of Pure Land, can still be interpreted as action leading to rebirth. Mixed cultivation is to confuse the two kinds of practice, proper and assistive, as well as the cause of rebirth. After having faith in the Buddha's wisdom, according with the Buddha's vows, and knowing the Buddha's kindness, then of course, chanting is an appropriate service. Contemplation is also something to be cultivated. Prostration, holding the name, praise, and offerings are all appropriate. This is the explanation of the 5 correct practices of Shandao. However, the distinction between self-power and other power lies in unswerving faith versus incomprehension, according with the vows versus not according, and knowing his kindness versus not knowing. If your esteemed opinion can stay within this, then it is compatible with the teachings of this tradition, that is, Jodo Shinshu. That is to say, even such difficult practices as those that Honen cultivated can still be causes for rebirth in the Pure Land if they are based on faith in other power. If one undertakes them thinking that one will thereby accumulate merit, and that by dedicating that merit, one will attain rebirth without any assistance from Amitabha, then one is going to fail. Okay, we are about halfway through the presentation now. I'd arranged with Professor Chan that we might take a 5-minute break at about this point. So with everyone's permission, let's all catch our breath for just a few minutes and
Yes, okay,
take a
sure.
drink of
We
tea.
have to take a break for 5 minutes.
Okay,
我们
good.
休息一下，因为Professor Jones 他希望休息5分钟，所以我们现场的观众大家可以先去上个洗手间啊，我们5分钟后准时开始啊，现在7点41分，我们7点46分准时开始。 好，我们第二个阶段继续开始。
好的。All right, let's go to slide number 19 in the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, make sure first that my microphone is on, you can hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay, so slide 19. Seeing that Yang judges Honen's teachings by their agreement with the sutras, and that Shakyamuni's words command the highest authority, Ryusen presents a chain of custody that transfers Shakyamuni's authority to Honen and Shinran. He says, Amitabha's fundamental vow is fulfilled at present, so Shakyamuni gave the teaching. It cannot be empty words. If the Buddha's teaching is true, then Shandao's explanation cannot be just empty words. Given that Shandao's explanation is true, then how can Honen's words be empty? Now move to the next slide, number 20. Another exchange deals with Shandao, recognized as a patriarch or Zhu in both Chinese and Japanese Pure Land. In commenting on the 10 nian, the Shi nian, of the 18th vow, Shandao had used the word sound, sheng, as a classifier, thus clarifying that the practice entailed oral repetition of the name rather than visualization of the Buddha's image or contemplation of the name as a mental sound image. Yang objects that this is only one method of Nianfo among many. To insist that oral invocation represents all of Nianfo to the exclusion of any other form violates the teachings of many sutras. Yang also notes that Shandao was working from Chinese translations of the sutras and insists that one must check the Indian originals before accepting Shandao's interpretation as authoritative. Finally, Yang says that oral recitation and mental intention, or xin yi, might diverge, in which case, as he says, the mouth might be uttering the Buddha's name while the mind is occupied with the 5 desires. So now go to slide 21 for Ryusen's answer. So Yang Wenhui has raised 3 points. Regarding the first point, Ryusen accepts that the sutras and commentaries do indeed present a variety of forms of Nianfo, but points out that Amitabha's 18th vow selected xuanzi only oral invocation as suitable for practitioners. Therefore, Shandao is on more solid doctrinal footing in asserting that holding the name, Chengming, is the one proper practice for rebirth. To Yang's second point about the need to check Chinese sutra translations against their Indian originals, Ryusen responds that these have largely been lost since the Buddha Shakyamuni's time, and he actually reverses Yang's priorities or Yang's position in saying that many of them are unreliable since they do not tally with the Chinese versions. In other words, while Yang is saying we can't trust the Chinese versions unless we check them against Indian originals, Ryusen says, actually, in many cases, we don't have the Indian originals, and in other cases, the Indian originals themselves are not as reliable as the Chinese versions. Given this, there is no problem with Shandao basing his interpretation on Chinese versions of Buddhist scriptures. Now go to slide 22. Ryusen's response to Yang's third point is very complex. He says, the 19th vow says, sincere mind, joyful and trusting, desire to be born in my land up to 10 times. If they do not achieve rebirth, then I will not enter into highest enlightenment. These three minds, that is the joyous mind, the sincere mind, and the desire to be reborn, these three minds plus the 10 Nian seem like two, but are really one. The mind that one possesses produces the practice, like water producing waves. How would our school, that is Jodo Shinshu, assert that oral recitation and the mind have nothing to do with each other? The 10 Nian and the three minds correspond. So Shandao explained them as holding, or cheng, and used the term 10 sounds, shi sheng. However, it is not the case that oral holding, or ko cheng, actually departs from mental functioning and stands alone. The word nian involves both mind and voice. The word sound places the emphasis on the act of speaking, and this is why he only said 10 sounds. Thus, there is a qualm, there is a doubt that oral invocation is separate from mental function and stands by itself. So it was translated as 10 nian, a translation that must include the three kinds of mind. But since it says 10 nian, later generations thought it meant contemplation of the thought, guanxiang, or contemplation of an image, guanxiang. And so they lost the whole reason why the easy practice is easy and turned their backs on the 5 kalpas that Amitabha spent deliberating on his fundamental intention. Therefore, by rendering it as sound, shang, it was Shandao's intent to retain both meanings, that is, oral and mental, and to clarify the intention behind the vow. Okay, that is very complicated. According to Ryusen, Shandao corrected a tendency to interpret nian as a purely mental practice with no oral component by using the word sound to describe instances of nianfo. That would clarify for Shandao's readers that they were, in fact, supposed to recite the name out loud without losing the mental component. However, this does not entail eliminating the mental component, since oral recitation of the Buddha's name must proceed from the 3 minds described in the 19th vow. The implication is that he agrees with Yang that distracted recitation done while the mind is wandering is not effective. So Shandao's authority remains intact. So let's have the next slide, number 23. Returning to the issue of bodhicitta, Puti-xin, Yang continues to argue that anyone who wants to attain rebirth in the Pure Land must generate the mind of enlightenment as a definite prerequisite. Ogurusu points out that the Kegon or Huayan monk Miaowei or Miaohui in the 12th to 13th centuries, of the Kozanji, wrote critically of Honen's apparent disregard for the importance of generating bodhicitta. This, he says, shows that Miaowei only knew about self-power bodhicitta, but not about other power bodhicitta. So Zili Puti-xin and Ta Li Puti-xin. Excuse me. In fact, Honen's Senchakushu only dispenses with, or she, self-powered bodhicitta while establishing other-powered bodhicitta. Ogurusu further elaborates that there were 2 pairs and 4 types, that's 二双四种 of bodhicitta. So we'll look at those in the next slide, slide number 24. So Ogurusu says, question, what are the 2 pairs and 4 types? Answer, the first is the vertical escape, shu chu, of the Faxiang and Sanlun schools, which require long periods of practice to arrive at bodhicitta. The second is the vertical transcendence, shu chao, of the Huayan, esoteric, and Chan schools, which teach the bodhicitta of this mind is the Buddha. These 2 require self-power and are part of the path of sages, the Sheng Dao. The third is the lateral escape, Heng Chu, which is the self-power bodhicitta of the 19th vow. The fourth is the lateral transcendence, Heng Chao, which is to have faith and joy in the 18th vow. Vertical means self-power. Lateral, Heng, means other power. Escape, Chu, means that it takes a long time, and transcendence, Chao, means it is sudden. So if you go to slide 25, it summarizes the 2 pairs and 4 types. You can take a moment to look at that. And then we'll go to slide number 26. So Yang objects to what Ogurusu has said. Yang, referring to other arguments that Ogurusu had made in the course of the controversy, retorts, this grossly violates the meaning of the sutras. The text of the 18th vow takes in beings of all capacities. It is, as the Lotus Sutra says, one chant of homage to the Buddha and all will have already become Buddhas. The 19th vow separately takes in those of superior grade capacities, 相品机. Here you say the 19th vow leads only to rebirth in a transformation land, 化土, and that the 18th leads directly to the realization of nirvana, 觉证涅槃. No sutra says this. Before moving on to Ryusen's reply, it might be a good idea to review the texts of the 18th and 19th vows as found in the Wuliang Shou Jing. So go now to slide 27. So the 18th vow says, if when I attain Buddhahood, sentient beings of the 10 directions who direct their minds with faith and joy to the wish to attain birth in my land, even for 10 moments or 10 thoughts, 10年, if they do not attain birth, then I will not enter into perfect enlightenment. I exclude only those who commit the 5 heinous acts or slander the true Dharma. Vow number 19 says, if when I attain Buddhahood, sentient beings of the 10 directions who generate bodhicitta and cultivate all merit and who wish to, with sincere mind, generate vows desiring rebirth in my land, do not see me surrounded by a great multitude when they die, then I will not enter into perfect enlightenment. In terms of the 2 pairs and 4 types, from a Shin perspective, from Jodo Shinshu, the 18th vow takes in all sentient beings of the 10 directions and demands nothing of them except recitation of the name with faith and joy. Thus, it is open to everyone and qualifies as sudden. According to Jodo Shinshu, the 19th vow, in contrast, seems to be aimed at beings who aspire to rebirth in the Pure Land, but seek to attain this through the merits of their own practices. This shows that they still believe they still believe self-power will work for them. And since they must first complete all these practices to attain rebirth, it means that their path is slow and gradual, not sudden. It also shows a lack of faith in the vows of Amitabha, at least in the crucial selected 18th vow, and that it is actually inferior to the way of faith. That is why Ogurusu had previously said it leads to rebirth in a transformation land, a Huatu, something that in the history of Pure Land Buddhism in China means a Buddha land adapted to the capacities of beings who cannot see it as it really is, and so is, in a way, inferior. This was why the tradition following Honen had considered the 18th vow selected, 选择. Why would one follow the 19th vow and potentially spend innumerable lives performing difficult practices when, in reliance on the 18th vow, one could attain rebirth in the Pure Land immediately after death? Okay, so now we are ready to see how Ryusen responds. We'll go now to slide 28. So Ryusen says, since the text of the 18th vow says all sentient beings of the 10 directions, it definitely takes in beings of all capacities. However, its words 10 nian, 10 nian, correspond to those of the lower grades, the Xiapin, of the Contemplation Sutra. Thus, it means to focus exclusively on the Buddha Amitabha, distinguishing it from the broad refuge in all Buddhas as found in the Lotus Sutra. Let me say here that when Yang quoted the Lotus Sutra, the Lotus Sutra just says to say homage to the Buddhas, not specifically to Amitabha Buddha. So that distinguishes it from the broad refuge in all Buddhas found in the Lotus Sutra. The 19th vow has some feeling of self-power and was preached for those who cannot generate faith in the other power of the 18th vow. That is why it advises cultivating merit and then dedicating the merit to rebirth. It does not necessarily apply to those of superior capacities. A further volley of arguments follows about Tanluan's, whose dates are about 476 to 542, Tanluan's interpretation of the generation of bodhicitta, which Yang claims accords fully with all the sutras. Ryusen's reply asserts once more that Tanluan also made a distinction between self-power bodhicitta and other power bodhicitta. Thus, as with the previous exchange about the place of other practices in Honen's life, the 60,000 repetitions of the Nianfo every day and the contemplations, the conclusion is that the generation of bodhicitta arising from the practitioner's assertion of self-effort will not avail in the present age. But bodhicitta that arises from an upwelling of faith and entrusting will work. So that's the arguments. They are very complicated. So now I will summarize the arguments under 4 different headings. So number 1, the Jodo Shinshu missionaries, in teaching exclusive reliance on the 18th vow, had rendered bodhicitta unnecessary. Yang objected that this violated the scriptures. Ogurusu and Ryusen replied that by distinguishing self-power bodhicitta from other power bodhicitta, their teaching did not exclude bodhicitta. It only taught that bodhicitta itself needed to arise from reliance on other power. So Yang says they are eliminating bodhicitta. They say, no, we are not. It just has to be other power, bodhicitta. Number 2, Yang said that Honen was hypocritical in teaching exclusive reliance on other power because he recited the name 60,000 times every day and practiced visualization with great success. Ogurusu and Ryusen used the same strategy here to distinguish self-powered practice from other-powered practice. On a side note, this would actually be true of Honen, but not Shinran, but they're not talking about Shinran, so it doesn't matter. Honen did teach that other practices were permitted after one had begun a regular practice of Nianfo. So he didn't go as far as Shinran did. Number 3, Yang held that Shakyamuni and the sutras that preserved his teachings had the highest authority, and that the missionaries were too quick to put their trust in later teachers like Shandao, Honen, and Shinran, even when their doctrines violated the sutras. This argument is actually true for the Jodo Shinshu, and in just a moment we'll see the reason for that. But here we can remember that Ryusen's chain of custody argument that said what Amitabha said is true, therefore what Shakyamuni said is true, therefore what Shandao says is true, therefore what Honen and Shinran say is also true. So this was an argument that, yes, their teachings do have the same authority as the Buddhist sutras. Finally, number 4. Yang seemed to have argued that Buddhism offered a number of paths or dharma gates, famen, to suit beings of all capacities, while the missionaries taught that all beings whatsoever should rely exclusively on the 18th vow and the sole practice of oral Nianfo. This argument also rings true, but Ryusen took it for granted. Ryusen took pains to point out that one cannot practice oral Nianfo without involving other faculties as well. Distracted mumbling of the name while the mind wanders in other things simply will not work. And because of the interpenetration of all things, one cannot recite the name out loud without involving other faculties such as hearing and thought. By this strategy, Ryusen demonstrated that the Jodo Shinshu teaching of sole reliance on Nianfo affected the whole person. However, because they still maintained that all beings must engage only in this single practice, I doubt that Yang would have found this argument convincing. The debate does not stop here. There are many more exchanges touching on many other topics, and they would require an extensive amount of translation and transcription and commentary if we were to follow them. The above will serve as a sample of the back and forth between the combatants. To the end, Yang maintained that the words of the Buddhas found in the sutras outweigh any teaching given by later thinkers, while Ogurusu and Ryusen held that Yang was stuck in the path of sages, the Shangdao, and did not understand and had missed the Pure Land path. All right. So, slide 29, we'll look at some conclusions. So move now to slide number 30. As Jacob Zamorsky has written, OgurusuKōchō and Ryusen wrote in their capacity as official representatives of the Jodo Shinshu, but Yang Wenhui represented no single institution of pure or a Pure Land school in his critiques. He spoke only for himself. While granting that Zamorsky is basically correct in this observation, I would contend that Yang Wenhui occupies a more representative position than might be apparent at first glance. As I noted in a previous work, Pure Land Buddhism in China was not a sectarian movement, but a tradition of practice, a dharmagate, a famen. And so the criteria by which someone might be seen as representing it are tricky. Yang, however, puts forth views and citations fully in line with the tradition he himself understood and practiced Pure Land in accordance with the teachings of Yunqi Zhuhong, the 8th patriarch of Chinese Pure Land. To this extent, his views on Pure Land were well within the mainstream, and we can reasonably consider him typical of the Chinese tradition. So my point here is, it's not official representatives of a tradition arguing with a single individual. I am arguing that Yang Wenhui does, in fact, represent Chinese Pure Land as well as anybody else. Now go to the next slide, number 31. The primary issue in this debate concerned the Jodo Shinshu teachings that deprecated self-power as useless and advocated complete reliance on the other power of Amitabha. As noted in my previous book, Chinese Pure Land never went to that extreme, but promoted a kind of synergy or cooperation between the two powers. I'm reminded of a phrase that Zhi Yu of the Xilian Jinyuan used, 自他二力. However, as the debate proceeded, sources of authority came to the forefront as the real crux of the dispute. For Yang Wenhui, the word of Shakyamuni as presented in the entire corpus of Buddhist scriptures remains the final arbiter in doctrinal matters. The fact that the Shin missionaries could espouse a doctrine that rendered so many of Shakyamuni's teachings null and void was bad enough. But to deny the plain teachings of much of the text of the 3 Pure Land Sutras themselves in favor of the selection of the 18th vow went altogether beyond the pale. As Chen Jidong has pointed out, the Japanese side considered the matter from an entirely different angle. After the initial persecution of Buddhism under the new Meiji regime after 1868, a reconstitution of the schools of Japanese Buddhism encouraged belief in the absolute authority of the founders of those schools. Thus, for Ogurusu and Ryusen, figures like Shandao, Honen, and Shinran did have the authority to declare on doctrinal issues, even if their assertions violated Buddhist sutras. To judge from his writings, Ogurusu seemed surprised that this debate, arising after he had been working in China for over 20 years, should suddenly call into question teachings that he considered settled long ago within his tradition. For me, the most interesting participant in the exchange is neither Yang nor Ogurusu, but Ryusen. Yang's critique took the form of short letters and marginal notes, and his arguments do not generally go beyond the level of unsupported assertions. Ogurusu, as noted above, seemed unprepared to answer Yang and often fell back on repeating Shin teachings. His remarks were often quite compressed, leading Ryusen to apologize for his predecessor's terse presentations and to expand on them for more clarity. Ryusen himself entering the fray when Ogurusu became too ill to continue, was younger, more energetic, and much more engaging in his responses. He confronts Yang's objections head on and presents lengthy and reasoned responses. It seems a shame that I have not found any responses to him from the Chinese side, whether from Yang or from anyone else. It would be interesting as well to know if Ryu Sen's engagement of arguments had any impact on Jodo Shinshu literature or education afterwards. So in conclusion, while this particular exchange lasted only 3 years, the issues raised are still alive today. I have followed a Pure Land Facebook group, Facebook is Lianshu, for a long time that has members from both the Chinese and Japanese traditions, and I have seen these same issues arise more than once. Does one engage in traditional Buddhist methods of cultivation in addition to practicing Nianfo so that self-power and other power may interfuse for the best result? Or does one engage in drop all pretense of being able to save oneself and surrender to other power in a moment of true entrusting? The debate goes on. Please turn now to the last slide in the PowerPoint presentation. I thank everyone for their attention, and I look forward to your feedback and for correcting all the mistakes that I know that I have made. I believe the plan now is for Professor Chan to give a summary
Yes.
in 普通话。
好的，谢谢非常谢谢 Professor Jones 给我们很精彩的讨论哈。他也提到 mentioned that he has been to 西莲净院located in North Taiwan for 3 years and studied Pure Land Dharma with Venerable Ziyu. So in Taiwan, he found that the Pure Land thought of China or Chinese or Taiwan was very different from the Pure Land Dharma of Japan. 所以很多西方学者认识净土法门，其实是早期很多是透过日本的净土法门、净土宗鸠多术或是鸠多心术、净土真宗来了解中国的净土法。那么这个研究的兴起，就是刚才 Professor Jones 说的，他到了台湾的这样一个经验，了解到，中国的净土法门跟日本的净土法门，他早期接触到的是不一样的，尤其是 self power 跟 other power， 自力跟他力的不同了，那这里谈到的是偏依善导的问题。我们都知道法然上人他创立了净土法门、净土宗了，日本的净土宗，是所谓的偏依善导，依照善导的观经术的说法，而认为往生极乐世界这个不需发菩提心刚才这个 Bodhisattva 一直在讲 generating Bodhisattva 是否是 is needed, is necessary or not to be rebirthed in the Pure Land， 是否需要呢？往生极乐世界是否需要发菩提心？那么日本净土宗当然就认为是不需要的。那么到了亲鸾的净土真宗，更是废除了，只是需要信就行，连念佛都不需要的。但是这里就有很大的吊诡，也就是今天杨仁山居士认为日本净土宗尤其是小立西香顶OgurusuKōchō 到了中国来弘法的时候对于这个真宗教史，他写的这个真宗教史的这个作品呢，也有一点问题。那本来我个人读杨文慧、杨仁山的作品，我是认为他其实他的初衷并不是说要去针对净土真宗的一种 要置他于死地的这样的说法，他是出于好意觉得在弘扬净土法门，可能他这个是有所偏颇，而且他当然他是从南条文雄里面，刚才Professor Jones 都有提到了那个净土古义史本这个等等都透过南条文雄，他有这个样的这以前中国遗义的这些净土经典去看，乃至于看到了包括后来读到了这个小笠西乡鼎的真宗教子，所以他就写了这个评真宗教子的这个说法。但是南条文雄没有回应这个问题，他就传到这个所谓的小笠西乡鼎东本院士那里去他传到东本院士去。那小笠西乡鼎看到之后，就好像觉得杨仁山要置净土真宗于死地一样，所以他的回复一开始就不太客气了语言的刺激性非常的武断认为说，简单讲就是说，杨仁山他对于这个净土宗的这个理解是不够深刻的，而且他所说的话是好像要断本宗之头就好像要让这个净土真宗于死地的。但其实杨仁山一开始并没有这样的一个意思，只是说为了要弘传教法，彼此之间可以互相切磋讨论。那所以等种种的论辩之后呢，后来小笠西乡鼎，刚才我们 Professor Jones 都有列出他整个来往的这些书信论辩的文章。后来这个 Dragon Boat 如秀那个卢胜这个龙舟接续又做了一些论辩，因为小笠西乡鼎后来他生病了就没有办法继续。然后呢，龙舟的这个论辩后来杨仁山就不再接续下去，觉得说这样子永无了时啦，再这样子论辩下去的话是没什么意义的。本来是为了法，为了教义我们讲说无争之辩了，但现在变成义气之争，就没有什么意思了。那整个的论辩大体上是这样。那有几个议题，就是说圣道门跟净土门的问题了。净土真宗或是说净土宗，他们是废圣道门，并且要舍菩提心的，这是第一个要点。第二个就是念佛跟其他的杂行，他们认为善导废定善定善跟善全废，只有以第18愿为真实。他认为善导是这样子的说法，但是我们中国的净土宗不只是杨仁会啦、杨仁山、杨文慧所有的这个祖师大德都认为念佛法门其实是定善或是杂行正行俱可往生极乐世界，即便善导的观经术也是这样讲的。所以这里就引申了一个很重要的问题，就是解读的问题了。日本净土宗或是净土真宗在解读善导观经术的作品的时候，或是说他是5部9卷的作品的时候，他们是有他们自己的解释方法。那当然他们的解释方法就中国的祖师大德来讲的话，是导果为因或是说因地不真果招迂曲乃至于对于净土3经的解释他们以无量寿经为主，观无量寿佛经跟小本的阿弥陀经为辅为方便，不是真经，所以有所谓的立真废假的问题。所以这个都跟我们中国传统的净土法门完全不一样。那杨文慧当然是站在传统的经的立场乃至于中国传统经典的一种解释，但是净土真宗它是不是这样？它有很多坦白讲都是独自创说的独自创说的包括杂行杂修，这个我刚才讲过了。所以论辩的结果是每一个各自的立足点不同那么当然就难有结果，因为没有交集那杨文慧是根据经典为主，那小笠西乡鼎是根据善导为准的。 所以所依据的不同。那问题是他对于善导的解释又是他们日本人的解释，中国祖师大德对于善导的解释，后来啦宋以后啦，明清对善导的解释也跟日本人不一样。所以你说那怎么会有交集呢？到最后当然是不欢而散啊。大体上是要讲这一些了。那后来很重要的就是那个结语的部分，这个 Professor Jones 提了这个陈继东的说法，还有孙亚博啊，这个 Jacobs Zomowski 这个应该是这个他是那个是哪里的？应该是南斯拉夫还是哪一个？因为他在政大读书，以前是在政大读博士。我记得他的博士论文是他写的，他那个维氏在中国，民国初期维氏在中国
东欧洲的人，
东欧洲的人，对，
Yeah.
因为他那个博士论文我是口试委员，以前我记得他博士论文是我口试的，他那个论文写得很好，所以我想他今天提的这个，刚才 Charles 这个 Professor Jones 讲的是没错的，他这个 OgurusuKōchō 他是站在整个净土真宗的立场来辩论的，他是什么 role in their capacity as official representatives of 鸠州新属，对不对？ But 杨仁山呢 represented no single institutional Pure Land school in his critique， 所以他只是仅代表个人，他没有任何的所谓的宗派的问题。所以这个从这里那个刚才我这做一点跟各位介绍，就是说其实Professor Jones 他从这里延伸出是说，他认为整个我们在对于中国的净土教法我们不是把它看成一个 sectarian movement， 不是一个宗派的运动，因为它本身也没有形成宗派，因为日本才有所谓日本的净土宗，中国是没有净土宗的，中国只能够净土法门。所以他说他以前写过一些这样的作品，我刚才开场白跟各位说过，Professor Jones 他对于中国净土法门写很多很多的文章的，应该可能是现在目前我所了解西方学者里面，他应该写的量是最多的包括连到彻悟啦、云栖注文、偶义秩序这些，他都提过，他都写过单篇专门的著作还有包括最近出版了一本净土的专书。当他这里提到，他说 Pure Land Buddhism in China was not a sectarian movement, but a traditional practice。这是很重要的，我们讲的是一个法门，一个 practice 那所以呢 and so the criteria by which someone might be seen as representation it are tricky。 所以你说杨仁山要去代表谁，他没有代表任何人，你如果认为他要去代表谁的话，他是很 tricky 的，对不对？所以这个就是最后我们这个Professor Jones 他很重要的一个论点就出来，所以这也刚才才说到，那个没有一个论点，没有交集啦，没有交集，而且其实杨仁山的说法，我们从中国的传统来讲的话，他的说法是蛮有正统性的，蛮有正统性的。好，那么我就大体上谢谢这个Professor Jones 给我们的这样的讲演，我们现在把时间再交回给他请他来回答我们观众的提问。我们现在拿到了这个 the Q&A section. Please answer the question from the chat board.
Okay. You will have to tell me what the questions are because you know I have very bad vision and I have trouble reading these on my computer.
Okay, I'll read it for you. 小利息因为我跟观众解释一下，因为 Charles 这个Professor Jones 他的眼睛现在比较不好了，所以他说他看不到这个荧幕，所以我们来帮他念一下小利西乡鼎来中国弘扬净土真宗的思想，是否想要用日本佛教来征服中国佛教的意图，使用净土真宗的思想来改造中国佛教这是第一个问题。
Okay. I understand the question, but I will use English to answer. And if Professor Chen wants to help translate my answers, that's fine. What I understand is that the motivations were very complicated and they had to do with the political situation in Japan. So to repeat, in 1868, the Meiji Emperor resumed the throne, replacing the Tokugawa military government that had been in place for several hundred years. The Tokugawa government basically used Buddhist temples as government offices. They did the census, they counted the population, Japanese citizens had to register with a Buddhist temple, et cetera, et cetera. So as part of establishing his new regime, the Meiji Emperor persecuted Buddhism. It took away all of Buddhism's official government functions and took away a lot of their funding. It was a very bad time for Buddhism. So the Japanese Buddhists needed to find some way to prove that the Japanese government needed them. Okay, so that's one point. Another point is Japan was already beginning to think about how to expand its influence in East Asia. And so the Japanese Buddhists thought, well, there are Buddhists in Japan, there are Buddhists in Korea, there are Buddhists in China. We have a common religion. Maybe if we go to those other countries, we can use Buddhism to establish connections and make it easier for the Japanese government to acquire more influence in those places. I've looked a little bit at, the missionaries in China. A scholar from Yale, a Korean scholar named Hwan-Soo Kim, has written some very good books on Japanese missionaries in Korea who were pursuing the same goal. So I would say that if it were not for the persecution of Buddhism and this changing political situation, I don't think the Jodo Shinshu would have sent missionaries abroad. They didn't feel they needed to take Jodo Shinshu outside of Japan. Their primary motivation was to put an end to their persecution in Japan and prove themselves useful. And something I find very interesting is the fact that when Ogurusu arrived in China, that he found it wasn't as common as he thought. He could not easily use Buddhism as a point of contact with Chinese Buddhists because they were very different forms of Buddhism. And so I do think he was sincere when he wanted to spread Jodo Shinshu thought in China, but he also knew he had to be careful about it. And that's why he focused on Honen, Faran, Shangren, and not Shinran. So that's my understanding. If Professor Chen, if you think I didn't understand the question correctly, please correct me. And if you want to put anything I've just said into Mandarin, that's good.
是，好，谢谢。不知道我们的听众是否可以了解，大体上就是说，当时在明治维新的时候，因为在日本的宗教明治维新嘛，他们天皇就要废除这个佛教啊，乃至于要神佛分离啊，要建立一个政教一致的政体。所以在这样一个情况之下，他们净土真宗他们也有他们的存亡危机。在存亡危机的这样的情况之下啊，他们当然从另外一个这个存亡危机是说，他也必须要去依靠整个日本嘛。那当日本到中国来的时候，他也希望借由这个佛教来宣传他的这个所谓的，他总是认为，因为我都知道当时日本明治维新之后，认为所谓的亚洲他们是最为先进的国家嘛，我们都是比较落后的嘛。所以在这个小笠西香典来中国的时候，他也刚开始也是有这样的一个想法，但是后来他进来之后就发现情况不是这样子。那从另外一个角度，就是我刚才第二点要讲是， 虽然他是要这个废佛毁世啊，毁掉这个佛教明治维新的时候，但是他也是需要利用佛教来突出他这个自己这个日本的这样的一个在海外的这样一个怎么样一个政治的一个宣化吧。所以他也同时要利用这样的宗教。那在这个净土真宗在这个时候刚好也要去配合啊，配合这个所谓的宣扬国威的这个议题。所以有学者曾经也这样认为，就是如果从整个小立西乡顶跟杨仁山的论辩来看的话，有时候会认为他们不是全是法义的论辩啊，可能他背景是必须要配合日本政府对于东亚各国进行这个文化渗透跟侵略有关啊。那所以因此也就是这个小立西乡顶在1873年了哈，这个刚才讲演都有讲到，来到我们中国来开展传教活动。哦，所以就是说，从这个角度来讲，你这个传教活动跟他这个所谓的跟日本政府是有配合关系来做文化渗透跟侵略。但是，这个刚才 Professor Jones 他是不认为这样子啦，啊，当然有一些学者他是有这样一个看法的。好，那大体上是这个意思，我不知道我有没有解释错哈。那我们再来看第二题，我再帮老师念一下哈。大乘佛法讲求发菩提心呢，但是净土中的法然，就是日本的法然上人说不用发菩提心，那请问这符合大乘佛教的教法吗？
哎呦，Well, I feel very humble. I will simply say what I think is happening in this debate. The distinction is Japanese Pure Land Buddhism focused on the 18th vow. It said the 18th vow of the Wuliang Shou Jing was proper for people of this world. And the 18th vow does not say you need to generate bodhicitta. Okay, but the 19th vow does say it. Okay, the 19th vow is much more specific about actually engaging in practices of generating 3 kinds of mind, generating bodhicitta, engaging in Buddhist practices and self-cultivation, and then dedicating the merit to rebirth in the Pure Land. Okay, so the argument here is how you interpret those scriptures. For Yang Wenhui, both of those vows carry equal authority. There is no difference. So for Yang Wenhui, he will simply say, look, the Wuliang Shou Jing says you need to generate bodhicitta. It's there in the 19th vow. But the Jodo Shinshu used the language of the selected 18th vow, you know, 选择本愿, and said it would stand by itself. So when we look at the debate, we see Ryusen, 那个龙舟, saying that the 19th vow was basically for people who couldn't have faith in the 18th vow. So in a way, it's inferior. Okay, it has been replaced by the 18th vow. So that's the real difference. How do you interpret scripture? Yang Wenhui says every part of that sutra carries equal authority. The Jodo Shinshu says, no, the 18th vow is more important, and it does not say you need to generate bodhicitta. I am not going to say who I think is right and who is wrong.
OK， 是这个 Professor Jones 他没有正面去回答说这样的发菩提心是否符合大乘教法。他说他非常 very humble to answer this question。所以依照他们的论辩的内容，就是当然真宗是以第18愿为真实的。那第18愿当然就是念佛为称名嘛，自心信要。那所以就称为本愿真实教。所以我刚才讲，他们都以大经为主要的真实教。那第19愿呢？那18愿就是正定句现身正定句。那后来第19愿的发菩提心，刚才 Professor Jones 提到，那他们把它说成是邪定句，因为他们重念佛而轻发菩提心所以这个是当然从净土三经来讲的话，这已经违背经义了，但他们是这样的一个说法。所以就18愿的乃至10念或是观经的下品下生那等等，他们就认为只要称佛之外呢，一概全部都遮前了所以这个就是真宗所谓所讲到，刚才讲到那个第18愿。那所以他认为用第18愿来遮前第19愿，所以第18愿是本愿王那当然这个杨文会不认可，这个刚才 Professor Jones 没有提到了他当然他是不认可的，他觉得48愿每一个愿都很重要不可以单选这个第18愿成为愿王，而排除其他的愿48愿愿愿皆真所以这个是杨文会的说法。好 ，OK， 我补充到这里，我们再看下一题。杨文会认为道错虽分圣道门跟净土门，但是立净土而少圣道是真宗自创的宗旨所以这个已经逾越了中国净土中的梵理。小立西厢顶呢，则是将圣道门跟净土门判为对立的两门。那请问这是不是误解了龙树菩萨难行道跟易行道的说法？
你把我看成那个高级菩萨。
我们的观众都很厉害的，对于这一方面很有研究的。
我不敢当。Okay. Again, I will simply remark on what is being said within the debate. And I have to say, I have not read all the materials in the debate. I had to focus, and so I focused on what they said about self-power, other power, and bodhicitta. I do know that Ogurusu and Ryusen frequently claim that Yang Wenhui is stuck in the path of sages, the Sheng Dao, and that he has missed the Pure Land path, the Jingtu Dao. And that, of course, does come from Dao Chuo's An Le Ji. But I think Yang Wenhui would disagree. In fact, I think Yang Wenhui is actually fairly close to Honen's, Faran Changren's, his views. Because as I said before, Honen never really said, do not ever do other practices. Okay, when I read Honen, I think he's a little closer to Chinese Pure Land Buddhism than Shinran.
Yeah.
What Honen did seem to say is, before you start doing other practices, make sure you start with Nianfo. Because Nianfo, I mean, I like to say in English, that is your safety net, right? If you think you are going to achieve rebirth in the Pure Land by your own practices, then you probably won't make it. But if you start with Nianfo, then later, once you have established your practice and you've got the habit of practicing Nianfo, then you can do other things. In fact, Honen points out that after you are reborn in the Pure Land, you will be doing those other practices, because the Pure Land is not where you go to rest and relax. The Pure Land is a perfect Daochang, where you can practice and become a Buddha. So I think Yang Wenhui is actually not that far from Honen, but Ogurusu and Ryusen are Jodo Shinshu. And this is why the debate can be a little confusing. They are representing Shinran's view, but they're only talking about Honen, right? So this can make the debate a little bit confusing. And so they are reading Honen through Shinran, and they're representing Honen as making that strict distinction between the Sheng Dao and the Jingtu Dao, right? So I'm sorry, this answer may be just as confusing as everything else, but that's what I think is happening, that Ogurusu and Ryusen are using Honen to represent Shinran, and that I think creates a little confusion.
对，这个很重要，就是对刚才 Professor Jones 讲到，他们虽然谈的是法兰，但是 Ogurusu 这个 Kocho 跟这个龙舟呢，它其实代表的是亲鸾的净土真宗，所以它这里就有一个很 ambiguous 这个非常吊诡的东西在这里了啊，所以他们其实谈的是法兰，但是刚才 Professor Jones 讲的很重要一点，其实法兰的观点还比较接近，跟亲鸾比较起来是更接近于我们中国净土法门或者中国古代祖师大德所说的。其实在我的研究里面，我认为法兰它虽然是提倡也是善导的这种持名念佛，但是他应该没有误解善导，因为他认为善导念佛它是身念是一啦，好，所以说刚才也提到那个声音哨的，刚才那个 Professor Jones 在提的时候，那个哨的，他其实在有这个声音 chanting the Buddha's name 的时候，在 chanting 的这个哨的时候，他是要意念的，所以说身念是一啊，是合一的，它是没有时间差的。这个其实我们去理解善导大师的持名念佛也是这样子的。所以善导大师虽然说持名念佛，他还是要意念佛德的，所以后来就他们包括日本净土宗或是现在弘扬净土真宗呢，他们说没有啦，他就是不需要，乃至于这个意念佛德都不需要，因为这个都变成杂行的所以杂行杂修在他们来讲的话，就违背了弥陀本愿的他力就是到最后要单凭信心。但是杨文慧就认为，前面Professor Jones 也有提到自力跟他力的问题，他也提到说，这个杨文慧其实很强调的是不能够只靠佛力或是就是日本的所谓的纯他力而不需要自力的这样的因素在里面，是需要的。所以一切众生如果都只靠佛力的话，那么一切众生不就早就都往生极乐世界了吗？所以往生极乐世界靠他力之外，也要靠自力，就是自力、自他二力并重。所以我们中国法门讲的就是二力法门从谈卵一开始就是这样。所以刚才前面有问到那个谈卵那个发菩提心一样，谈卵也是一直强调是二力法门，但是恰恰很吊诡，他们要尊谈卵道作为他们的祖师七祖里面，但是他们居然就没有把谈卵道错的这种教法把它好好的读清楚。那我们只能够说他们是以他们自己的一种诠释啦这样的诠释到最后就是要谈的，但这个也没有人敢回答。有人就问说，那这样子他们这种教法能不能够往生？修行就是两件事情嘛，就是它的有效性跟可行性嘛。那当然它是可行可以这样子平时就 practice 行住坐卧都可以念佛乃至于只要起信就好了。但是问题有没有效，就谈到这个问题，是否能够顺利往生那当然这个我们比较 humble 的说法，就如同刚才我们是学者，不敢去讲这个问题，包括 Professor Jones， 我们没有办法去谈他的谁对谁错，我们只按照他们的论辩去谈。但如果是中国的祖师大德来讲，包括我现在所了解很多中国的法师包括现在就认为这个能不能往生是有一些有待商榷的 有待商榷的。你们到网络上查一些材料，他们会提到有一些法师弘扬净土法门的，就对净土真宗就非常的排斥，甚至认为是异端来的。已经被判为异端。这个是中国净土法师净土法门的弘扬的这些法师这样的。当然我们学者我们现在只谈学理了这个东西是否怎么样的情况，这个已经超越我们现在所可以提的。我们现在这个部分就先不要讲就先不提。好，那我们就再回到我们下面一个问题吧。好，感谢老师慈悲用清晰简单的语言来讲解自利跟他利的论证问题一是自利跟他利在修行中重要吗？问题二，从日本佛教的发展来看，日本僧团的创新跟实践，让佛法堪与基督教等融合汉传佛教尽管有了人间佛教的创新，但依旧无法与时并进。这是不是来源自这个自利他利的分叉呢
？OK 我可能不够了解问题在哪里。
他可能的意思是说，日本人把这个所谓的日本佛教，如果以净土真宗这样来看的话，它的创新跟实践，跟基督教的这种弘法方式，因为已经趋近于到了神教，完全都是他利，都是上帝的方式吧，应该是这样子。所以呢，那这样子是否对于这个来源是否他说这样的分差？是否跟与时并进是否在弘扬上会比较好一点
？OK， 了解了。Okay, well, there's a very interesting connection there that goes to the reason why scholars in the West were very slow to begin studying Pure Land Buddhism. I find it very hard to believe that my book on Chinese Pure Land Buddhism came out in 2019, after Westerners have been studying Buddhism for more than 100 years. It's the first book to look at Chinese Pure Land Buddhism. We have many books on Tibetan Buddhism, many books on Chanzong Sixiang, many books on Theravada Buddhism. And one of the reasons I frequently hear is that Pure Land Buddhism is too much like Christianity. And many people in the West who study Buddhism come from a Christian background, but they really don't like Christianity, and they are looking for something else. They are looking for an alternative. So when they see Pure Land, it looks too much like what they're trying to get away from. They want heroic practices, strenuous practice, really working for yourself. And so they don't want to hear about self-power versus other power, because they do think it looks too much like Christianity. I don't think they had that problem in China because China is where Pure Land was born. Pure Land thought and practice had been there already for more than 1,000 years before the Japanese missionaries arrived, or even the Christian missionaries arrived. They knew that it was different, okay? They knew, for example, that Amitabha is not like Jesus. He is not the son of a God who created the world. They also knew that the Christian heaven is not like the Pure Land. In Christianity, heaven is where you go to rest. Your work is all done. You just go there and hang out. Whereas I think what's important to realize about Pure Land Buddhism is that being reborn in the Pure Land is not the final goal. Becoming a Buddha and helping other sentient beings is the final goal. It is still Mahayana Buddhism. And when you become a Mahayana Buddhist, one of the 4 Mahayana vows is sentient beings are numberless, but I vow to save them all. So Pure Land Buddhism is really just a recognition that the present world is just not the best place to become a Buddha. It's very hard to do it here. It's like it says in the Wuliang Shou Jing, where Shakyamuni Buddha says, 1 day of practice in the present world is equal to 100 years of practice in the Pure Land, because this world is just so hard. So I think in China, they knew that Pure Land Buddhism and Christianity were very different from each other, because the Christian missionaries tried to show them that it was actually the same thing, and they didn't believe it. I hope that answers part of your question. I'm not sure if that really is what you were asking, but it's an interesting topic. I am also very glad to say that now more scholars in the West are becoming interested, and there are more publications on Pure Land Buddhism. And so I hope that our knowledge of this tradition will increase rapidly in the near future.
对，其实近来西方学者西方人对于净土法门也渐渐的有在接受了哈。你看网络上有一些西方的出家众，他也是除了他不是 Theravada 的，他是马哈亚纳的话，他会弘扬净土法门，他会讲净土法门。当然早期是用禅，但是现在净土法门他们渐渐的了解，这个渐渐的了解就是说除了要发菩提心的之外，还有这个所谓的进入第一义谛，因为中国净土法门讲理事嘛，事一心不是理一心，那到这个理一心的话，它这个跟那个基督教或者所谓的净土真宗那个说法完全不一样。所以净土真宗在讲说弥陀本愿是救度法门，没有条件的，只要有信心就好了那这样子的话，它的法门更加简单的，更远超于基督教了更比基督教更简单了那所以你有时候你用这种方式，像我刚才讲的，西方人早期去认识净土法门是透过日本净土宗或是净土真宗因为他们是学习日文，他去因为日本的佛教研究，包括日本的这比较先进，所以他们去透过这样去了解净土真宗，往往这样的理解又不是中国的净土法门，或是说我们觉得它就不是比较纯正的净土法门那所以现在如果渐渐的我们比较所谓的传统性的或是所谓的纯正的净土法门去弘扬到西方去的话，我想这个对西方人的这个接受度会提高的，要不然他认为我都已经有一个基督，有一个天堂了，我干嘛还要一个阿弥陀佛，还有一个阿弥陀佛的这个苏卡巴底，根本是不需要的，因为他觉得是相同的嘛 ，Paradise 这个是一样的。所以其实如果让他真正的去分辨之后，他就知道他这个净土的苏卡巴底跟那个 Paradise 还是有不一样的，因为他必须要透过修行，透过去发菩提心，然后去那里净土是为了中途站继续修行，而到最后是为了要度众为主的，不是去享乐的。那所以刚才一直在强调菩提心，我们的观众提出菩提心这个是很重要的要点。所以他们说你不发菩提心，中国祖师大说你可能没有办法往生，因为那个是净土大乘法门嘛。你不发菩提心了，因地不真，果遭迂曲。那你发菩提心之后，你就如我刚才 Professor Jones， 因为现在的法门西方人所要他的一个选择性 alternative 是在于哪里？他觉得他要学习的是那一种和平共处世界和平那种发菩提心行菩萨道的为众生付出的这一种教法，不是只是为了去享受吧？那如果这样说，他就是另外一个选项来讲，他这个对于他来讲，净土法门、弥陀法门对他来讲是有吸引力的那包括里面的一个修行方式，它是一个禅定的修行因为今天也没有讲到他是否必须要一心不乱的问题。那到净土真宗都不谈这个一不一心的，菩提心都不谈了，还谈一心不一心的问题所以完全都靠他力了那所以这个如果是自力的时候，我们在谈那个一心不乱，那是否还需不需要一心不乱阿弥陀经小本阿弥陀经讲到，所以这个都是一样。如果说这边都把它加进去的话，西方人因为是呼应刚才我们观众所提的这个问题，西方人对这个净土的这个弘扬，我想他们会更加的了解，更加接受了那这个当然也是 Professor Jones 他的刚才有一个看法。 当然现在西方大体上都用禅修嘛，因为禅本身就是共法，因为包括这个就很让我们可以直接开展智慧，这是西方人最喜欢的一种方式啊，禅修。好，那我们再看下一题。时间到了吧？
时间到了，对。
对，时间到了，差不多了。那我们就因为时间的关系哈，我们今天的讲座就到此结束哈。那我们今天很感谢 Professor Jones 给我们这么精彩的讲演啊，尤其是后面的这一个结论呢，他再衍生出去，也告诉我们中国的净土法门，它是必须不是一个宗派的属性来看待它，我们必须要好好的去看到它的整个一个所谓的实践的过程。那它是在中国来讲，净土宗是狱宗，有这样的学者这样认为，像陈阳炯教授他们这样说。那即便如果是狱宗的话，就代表它跟禅有关系，它跟天台有关系，跟华严有关系。各宗各派都在修净土所以净土法门就是所有的法门无不从此法界流，所有的行门无不回归此法界大体上就是变成这样一个情况所以呢，最主要就是说那个Jodo Singh 的这个 missionary 呢，他们就是 reject many Sakyamuni's teachings 所以呢，他们是 ignore much to the text in favor of one specific vow go too far 我们可以这么说，它只是一个第18愿只是一个第18愿，对不对？所以这个也是第18愿，刚才 Professor Jones 所提出来的。那当然这个是杨仁山反对的嘛那所以呢，今天这一些他们的传播的这个 missionary 呢，他们这个可以说是一个所谓的一种学者的角度有很多啦那如果从只是今天谈的这个思想论辩来讲的话，那天一善导的这样的教法跟中国祖师大德的教法是完全不一样的那中国祖师大德或是当代的法师认为日本净土宗或是净土宗中的解释是误解了善导的教法那这个也是的确的那当然他们各自有各自的一个说法，好比我们讲说自心回向诚心自心这个回向发愿心，他是回向发愿心，他们自己就会改造。他说你能够回向发愿的话，就蒙心释迦牟尼蒙阿弥陀佛才能够回向，所以他就是我们讲的自心回向发愿，回向发愿他又加了一个蒙，承蒙的蒙，就蒙阿弥陀佛然后让你够回向，那这又改造经典原来的意思的所以如果你不好好去解读它的话，它有很多东西是他改造的是他改造所以这个还是要很细心的再去论辩，有很多的这个不同的这个句子一改造之后就完全不一样乍看之下相似了所以它变成刚才所谓的菩提心，刚才 Professor Jones 提出来，他有所谓的他力菩提心他力回向，这个又回向导向的所谓的净土阿弥陀佛的这个他力上面去了。那其实这个都是他们自己的说法那对不对？那就是另外你们再去看自己进一层的论辩了我们只能够提供这样一个看法给你比如说回向发愿蒙发愿回向加一个蒙字的话，那又完全意思不一样OK， 那我们今天非常感谢我们也感谢我们在座的这个各位观众们来聆听我们这一场讲座。那也非常感谢 Professor Charles Jones 给我们这么精彩的讲演其实如同我刚才一开始讲的周文广教授就是我们 Professor Jones， 其实他的中文名字是周文广周文广教授他对于中国净土法门的研究其实是非常深入的非常深入的，而且他有这个台湾经验，包括这个在台湾里面修学，乃至于当时在台湾也做了台湾的佛教问题，我刚才在开场白里面也有介绍 除了这个之外，包括人间佛教、太虚大师的这个佛教，他都有涉猎都非常的广泛。尤其是净土方面这一块，他可以算是西方学者中的非常重要的一位专家学者。我想大家应该都有读过他的著作我刚才讲的非常多的著作好，那我们今天的讲座就到此为止。我们再次感谢 Professor Charles B. Jones 给我们精彩的讲演，谢谢。
我感谢大家听我的热烈的意见请大家不怕改我的错误，好不好？
好，谢谢您客气了。好，感恩。好，如果你们有想要读这个周教授的著作的话，我手上有几篇他以前周教授曾经有给我也都是已经 publish 的。如果你们有兴趣的话，可以告诉我，我可以转传给你们，你们来拜读一下他这个英文，而且他的文笔用的特别的文雅，他那个英文字也是特别文雅，我觉得比较难读我们说我们有时候学者在写文章也有比较遣词用是比较浅白的，它是属于比较文言的、比较文雅的那一种类型的，是吧？我这样讲应该是对的，是好。那么我们现在就这次的讲座就到此结束，感谢周教授，阿弥陀佛，好，谢谢，再见，再见。
And ladies and gentlemen, we hope you enjoyed today's lecture. Thanks to Professor Charles B. Jones. Before we conclude, we would like to invite you to our next lecture. Title is The Zen Dharma Flourish in East, the Source and Influence of 中进路。禅法东盛，中进路的思想及其影响 will be presented by Professor Liu Gangkang from the University of the Toyoko. The lecture will take place on Friday, the 9th of June from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Hong Kong time. The seminar will be in Chinese and audience can also participate in the Zoom. We look forward to your participation in the next lecture. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night. Thank you.